I was born in silence. Not the gentle, sacred silence that welcomes a child into a world of love, but the kind that says, "Don't cry. No one will come." They said I was lucky to be born to a noble family. The fifth daughter of the Wen household. But luck is a word people use when they want you to feel grateful for scraps. My sisters had silver combs and laughter braided into their hair. I had duty pressed into my spine. I was the extra one, the one with too much opinion, too little charm. Quiet, they would say. Pretty your words. Lower your eyes. Fold your hands. So I folded, and folded, until the girl inside me was creased beyond recognition. They dressed me in gold the day they sold me. Not to a suitor, to a transaction. The Lee family had land and status but needed political favor. My father, who never remembered my birthday, smiled as if he were handing over a trophy. I was the trophy, and he, the man they gave me to, Lord Lee's third son, was beautiful the way firelight is beautiful. From afar, his smile didn't reach his eyes. His touch didn't seek warmth, only ownership. They called it a union. I called it surrender. The first night, I sat on silk sheets that smelled of unfamiliar perfumes. He didn't speak to me. Just unpinned my hair and said, "I like women who know their place." I learned to be a shadow. To smile with closed lips. To nod when I wanted to scream. The walls of his estate were gilded with wealth. But I lived like a ghost inside them. He fed his mistress sweet fruit in the garden while I served tea to his mother. He bought her embroidered shoes while I mended my own under candlelight. The servants pitied me, which is worse than hatred. Because pity doesn't fight for you. It just watches you rot in silence. My mother never visited. My sisters wrote once each in the first year. And then never again. When I fell ill one winter, burning with fever, bones aching like betrayal, he sent word to my family. They responded with a single line, "Do what is necessary. She's already been paid for." And something broke inside me then. Not like glass shattering, more like a bridge collapsing. The kind you can't rebuild. I found comfort in small rebellions. Humming when I bathed, writing poetry on torn cloth and burning it, letting the moonlight kiss my face when I should have been sleeping. But none of it saved me. The night I died wasn't dramatic. There was no blade, no poison, just childbirth, a daughter I barely got to hold. He wasn't there. Of course he wasn't. They said I died nobly, giving life. But I know the truth. I died because no one believed I was worth saving. Not my husband, not my family, not even the gods, it seemed. But the gods were listening. Because I woke up again. Back in my childhood room. The scent of plum blossoms outside. My mother's voice in the next hall. And my own hands, so small again. So soft. Not yet calloused by service. Not yet burned by betrayal. I was 15, the year they began looking for a husband to sell me to. But this time, I remembered everything. Every insult. Every silence. Every choice they made to protect their pride over my life. And I swore then, before the moon, before the ancestors, before my own trembling soul. This time, I won't be the girl they sold. This time, I won't fold. This time, I'll make them pay. I did not scream when I woke up. The air smelled of plum tea and warm earth. My body felt light, too light. Like sorrow had not yet taken hold of my bones. But my mind, oh, my mind remembered everything. Every betrayal, every silence, every time they looked through me like I was smoke and shame. My hands, smaller now, softer, trembled as I brought them to my chest. The sky outside the paper-screened window shimmered in gentle gold. Birds sang their morning songs, the same songs they sang the morning my world ended. I was young again, 15, the year they began weaving my fate into the ropes they would later use to bind me. But this time, I was not just a girl. I was a storm in silk. I watched them carefully, my mother with her brittle voice, my father with his permanent scowl, my sisters who smiled like blades wrapped in honey. I memorized them, not as family, but as characters in a play I had already watched. They thought I was soft. They didn't know softness could be sharpened. I spent my days studying not embroidery or dance, but silence. How to blend in, how to disappear in plain sight. But at night, I whispered to the stars. I traced the scars of my past life on the inside of my eyelids. And I planned. I began walking to the temple, saying it brought me peace. It did, but not in the way they thought. There, in the cool stone halls beneath faded murals of gods and ancestors, I read forbidden scrolls. I asked questions that made the monks pause. I listened to old women tell tales of fallen kingdoms and queens who rose from ashes. And I learned. One afternoon, I stood in the kitchen and watched a servant girl burn her hand. She was slapped for it. I flinched, but did not interfere. Instead, I slipped her ointment that night. I told her nothing, but she remembered. Small kindnesses, tucked into ordinary days, those were my first allies. When I discovered my younger brother had taken money from our family chest, I didn't report it. I followed him. I learned where he went, who he owed. I began weaving threads. A year passed. I grew into my face. Into my voice. I started to speak in ways they couldn't accuse. Wouldn't it be more respectable if we donated to the temple like the governor's wife? I wonder if the Lee family's prosperity is due to their more modern values. They heard manipulation, but they saw only obedience. And when the matchmaker returned, of course she did, like clockwork, with the same proposal from the Lee family, I smiled. In my first life, I had cried. This time, I curtsied. Yes, I said, I would be honored, because this time, I would not be the lamb. I would be the knife behind the veil. On the eve of the engagement, I slipped out beneath the moon and walked to the healer woman in the forest. You're early, she said, though we had never met. No, I answered, I'm exactly when I'm supposed to be. She took my hand. She looked into my eyes, and something flickered. I know you, she whispered. You will, I replied. And from her, I learned more than herbs. I learned how to shape silence. How to listen to the earth. How to find strength not in armor, but in stillness. On the day of my betrothal, I wore red. Not the bright, innocent red of a blushing bride, but deep crimson, the color of wine, of secrets, of blood not yet spilled. As the guests bowed and the bells rang, I stood beside the man who would one day destroy me. I looked up at him and smiled. Because now, I knew. And he would never see it coming. This life was mine to rewrite. And I would start by pretending to forget. I whispered to the servants. I played the game of tea and etiquette, learning who resented whom, who whispered behind which screen. I wrote anonymous notes to noblewomen about injustices in their households, always with a solution tucked inside. They never knew it was me. But my name began to drift through the air like a forgotten prayer returning to the living. Lady Shu. Wise. Elusive. Dangerous. I was not yet her, but I was on my way. At night, I practiced my poise by candlelight. I taught myself how to walk like power. How to laugh without warmth. How to look through someone instead of at them. Because the woman I was becoming, she would not beg to be loved. She would be remembered, and when they finally realized who I was, it would be far too late. My days in the Lee household began with tea and ended with silence. Not the kind of silence born from peace, but the silence of watching, of listening, of threading needles into the fabric of control. I was not the girl they believed they had acquired, I was their reckoning wrapped in red silk. I started by cultivating invisibility. I let their arrogance blind them, let them see me as nothing more than a dutiful bride to be. It gave me time to gather information, to learn names, relationships, hidden debts and old grudges. In my former life, I had known nothing but the surface. Now I understood power was not loud, it was knowing what others did not think you noticed. I began mapping every person in the Lee estate. The youngest servant boy who snuck food to his mother. The elderly steward who drank more than he should. The daughter-in-law who hoarded jewelry and resented her sister-in-law. Everyone had a flaw, a soft spot, a crack. I didn't need to punish them. I needed to understand them. Because when you understand a person's fear, you hold the leash they pretend doesn't exist. I found allies quietly, not out of trust, but out of shared injury. There was May, the seamstress's daughter, who had once been promised to a minor noble and then cast aside when his fortune grew. I asked her, gently, what would you have done if you'd had the chance to speak for yourself? She looked at me like I was the first person who'd ever asked. I gave her coin, not much, but enough to show I saw her. She began to sew not just my robes, but signals into them. Threads of color that meant messages. Who was talking? Who was watching? Who was leaving? There was also Elder Lu, an advisor of my future husband. Too old to climb, too wise to ignore. I praised his memory in front of the others. I told him I loved to hear stories of the old court. I asked questions no girl should have asked. He taught me more than politics. He taught me how fear moves through the veins of a family like poison, disguised as loyalty. Soon I was speaking in coded phrases. In the gardens, I made remarks about plants. Some trees only flower once they've been burned to ash, I'd say casually. One of the wives flinched. Another smiled a little too knowingly. They were listening. I arranged for a scholar to visit, an old friend of the healer woman. He brought scrolls with him, but not for reading. He slipped me documents on land ownership, merchant debts, trade routes. With every scroll, I saw the dynasty of the Lee family more clearly, not a fortress, but a web. And webs can be burned. I orchestrated a banquet. It was to celebrate the return of my future brother-in-law, who had supposedly secured a lucrative trade agreement. I made sure every noble family with old grudges was invited. I leaked, anonymously, news of the banquet to merchants who had been wronged by the Lee family. And on the night of the feast, as music floated through the halls and dancers spun in gold, whispers began. Isn't that the traitor whose ships were sabotaged? Why would she invite the widow of Lord Fan? The Lee family smiled through gritted teeth. My future husband toasted me. I bowed. Let them believe I was foolish. Because each person in that room owed me a favor, or wanted revenge more than they wanted propriety. I had always thought vengeance would feel like thunder. But it felt like this, calculated, deliberate, silent. I placed my pieces slowly. A rumor here, a confession overheard, a debt collected, until I became the eye of a storm no one knew was forming. There were close calls. One night, I found a note in my robe that hadn't come from May. It was unsigned, a warning, he knows. I stayed up until dawn, listening to footsteps, ready to burn the whole house down. But no one came, not yet. When I saw my mother again, she came for the wedding preparations. I did not look away. She looked older than I remembered, but no less sharp. Her words were coated in honeyed contempt. You've grown into your looks, finally. And you've grown into your regrets, I answered with a smile. She paused, just long enough for me to know the strike had landed. I began writing letters to distant provinces, seeking girls who had been cast aside, silenced, discarded. I told them nothing of myself. But I offered them one thing, a future built on truth. A few answered. One girl, Ja, had fled a cruel uncle and was working in a tea house. I brought her into the Lee household as a servant. She watched. She listened. She sent word. Each act of kindness I gave her, she returned with loyalty. I wasn't building an army. I was building a network. And soon, I would tighten the threads. In the final days before the wedding, I met with Elder Lu in the inner library. He poured tea with shaking hands. You're playing a dangerous game, child. I'm not playing, I said. I'm remembering. He nodded slowly. Then handed me a list. Names. Of those who had watched the first time and done nothing. I tucked it into my sleeve. And I smiled. Because the pieces were placed. And now, it was time to move them. They thought the wedding day would be my coronation into their control. A union sealed with silk and ritual, with me as the ornament they paraded to show power. But it was the day their illusions fractured. I stood in the center of the courtyard, veiled in gold, the crowd a blur of faces painted with forced joy and curiosity. Beneath that veil, I was a fortress of fire. As the priest began the rites, I glanced up, just once, catching the eye of my future husband. He smirked, as if already triumphant. He didn't know the poison had already begun its work. Not in his wine, but in the letters I had sent. One by one, people began to arrive who had not been invited. The widow of Lord Fan. The trader whose ships had sunk under mysterious circumstances. A former housekeeper from the Lee estate, trembling but proud. All of them entered with heads held high. And all of them carried stories. The priest faltered. My mother-in-law's fan stopped mid-sweep. I removed my veil. And I spoke. Calmly. Deliberately. I called each name. Told each story. Cited each injustice that the Lee family had buried under money and manipulation. My voice did not waver. But theirs did. They shouted. Denied. Called me mad. But the crowd listened. Because I had evidence. Because I had allies. Because I was no longer alone. I turned to my mother. You sold me, I said. Once. Never again. She said nothing. Because what defense is there, when the truth rises louder than dignity? My father tried to pull me away. I pulled free. I am not your daughter, I said. Not anymore. Gasps. A ripple through silk and whispers. But I stood taller. And then, my final move. A servant stepped forward and handed the priest a sealed scroll. It was a declaration, signed by Elder Lu, the governor, and 2 respected scholars. Stripped of title. Stripped of dowry. The wedding, nullified. My future husband spat at my feet. You'll regret this. I looked at him one last time. I already did. In another life. I turned my back to him. To all of them. And I walked away. The gate closed behind me with the sound of finality. But what followed was not triumph, it was ache. In my private chambers, I wept. Not for them, but for the girl I had been. For the innocence I would never reclaim. For the love I had once imagined, and the trust that would never return. Yet in that morning, I found clarity. I began to build, not walls, but bridges. To women like May, like Ja. I gathered them, listened, taught. We formed a sanctuary. We trained in negotiation, in law, in trade. The Lee family tried to retaliate. But I had prepared. Every threat was met with quiet retaliation. Contracts dissolved. Witnesses stepped forward. They were exposed not in fire, but in paper. In truth, the emperor's court took notice. A message arrived. Your silence has shaped more justice than our decrees. What name do you go by? I wrote back, Lady Shu. But names are less important than deeds. I was no longer the girl they sold. I was the architect of my freedom. And the ghost in their halls. Years passed, not in flashes but in quiet seasons. Rain on the tiled roofs. Lanterns lit for festivals. The laughter of girls who no longer feared the future. I no longer walked with the tension of vengeance held in my spine. I walked slowly, deliberately, knowing every step had been earned. The sanctuary grew. What began as a haven for a handful became a refuge known across provinces. Not a rebellion, a rebirth. We taught women to read, to negotiate, to lead. Each name they called me, Lady Shu, Mother of Silence, the Red Phoenix, I wore without pride, but with purpose. Sometimes the daughters of those who once scorned me arrived at my gates. Frightened, desperate, pregnant, abandoned, I let them in, not because I forgave their bloodlines, but because I remembered what it felt like to be turned away. There was no need to make them suffer. I let the world teach them. I simply taught them how to rise. I planted trees in the courtyard. Plum, like the one outside my childhood window. Jasmine, for memory. Osmanthus, for sweetness earned. One night, an old man came. He carried a walking stick and the weight of shame. My father. He did not ask to come inside. He stood outside the gate as it rained. I thought I'd see your face before I died, he said. I stood beneath the eaves and watched him. You already did, I answered. You just never looked. He left the next morning. I did not mourn him. On my 40th year, the emperor summoned me. His daughter had run away, seeking my sanctuary. He did not punish me. He asked me why. I said, because she wanted to become herself. And she knew where to go. He said nothing more, but later, a royal decree arrived, a library to be built in my name. Not with statues, with books, with records of what women had done, what we would do. I cried, not because I needed their recognition, but because once, I was a girl sold like livestock. And now, I was writing the future. I never married, not again. Love came, soft and unexpected. A scholar, quiet, gentle, with hands that had never held a weapon but carried stories with reverence. He asked nothing of me. He sat beside me, and that was enough. We did not wed, but we built a life. With shared gardens, shared glances, shared silence. When I was old, the girls I had mentored came to brush my hair, to hold my hand. Tell us again, they asked. And I told them, of the girl I once was. The life I was forced to live. The fire I became, and the peace I found. When I died, they did not bury me in silk. They buried me in red. And the blossoms bloomed for weeks longer that year. Because I was no longer seeking revenge. I was resting, and the world I left behind was finally worthy of the girl they sold.